figures. Just wanted to make a recap of what's on this engine at the moment. Starting with the intake, that's a mesh, really dirty one, but a mesh, steel mesh air filter, which is quite unrestrictive and makes a good sound. Then we get the M50 intake manifold, standard injectors. That's an M50 to fuel rail. In terms of spark plugs, I think I have some sort of Iridium spark plugs with quite a lot of miles on them. Moving on to the exhaust side, this so-called shorties exhaust manifolds from an M52 again. They are simple and robust and look like they flow pretty well, and they are connected in a very bad way downstream to a 2-inch exhaust pipe, which might be a bit small, and I have removed the catalyst, and it goes back through a straight pipe to the rear exhaust muffler, back box, whatever you want to call it, which is quite simple and empty. Apart from that, I did play a bit with the ECU, and I did some road tuning with a bit of added advance on the spark, and did play a bit with the Vanus intake, mostly I think because of the M50 intake manifold. There's no DISA and stuff like that, and I had to change a bit the Vanus in the region where the DISA valve switches over, so it doesn't have a dip or anything like that. On the road it feels pretty linear, so we'll see about that on the dyno. So that's about it. We'll see how it does on the dyno, considering the engine has 180 plus thousand miles on it, with a lot of track days. It has a lot of blow-by, so much that because I'm putting the crankcase ventilation back into the intake, it has a very rough idle, and every time I actually start the engine from cold, I just remove the crankcase ventilation and plug this hose in order to get it to warm up easier, because otherwise it just runs like crap. Right, so this is what actually happened with my bush. I took the bush out. This was welded somehow like that, so before I had issues with this part being welded to the rest, so I kind of welded it much better. But this plate was not welded that well. This would actually fit in like that. That's bolted to the frame or whatever, and that's bolted to the diff. So basically under load the diff just wants to push the nose up, and it's gonna pretty much do this and just stressed out the weld on this and finally gave up. I even had some sort of a plate here which probably lost on the track. Welded here, and somehow it actually stressed this part so much it developed a crack. This is my new setup. Just put a 4mm plate, recycled of course. This is one of the engine mounts that failed, and just drill the holes, and I'm gonna just bolt it on straight to this cross member here. That's where the diff bolt will go, and this will help distribute the load better, and it's gonna be solid mounted. And yeah, the only concern is the vibrations from the diff, so I'm gonna just test it out to see. Might put a plate to spread the load on this bit as well, because this is not that thick. I think it's 2mm maybe, and it can deform. We'll see how it goes. This is how it looks. Bolted on. Bolted to the diff here. And then that's bolted to the cross member. I use this plate here to spread the load a bit. This one was deforming as well, but should hold. So this is my dyno plot. It's not great, and we shall see why. I had 4 fairly consistent runs, with the best one being at 190 at the wheels and 220 at the engine. It's like 15% losses. And we had a fairly cold day at 12.5 degrees C. But the strangest thing is on the graph here, peak power being shown at 5,689 RPM, which is not realistic for this engine. So there's some sort of a mismatch in terms of the roller speed and the RPM speed. I did see the guy calibrate the rollers at 2500 RPM, which is consistent with the logs, and on the other hand the logs show the engine is hitting the rev limiter at 6800 every time. So couldn't really figure out why the mismatch in the RPM. One explanation could be clutch slip or tire slip, but I think this would be more visible on the curve, and inconsistent between runs. The runs were fairly consistent altogether. Another explanation for this mismatch could be tire deflection at higher speeds. Tires were inflated at 28 psi, so it's possible that at this higher speed they would deflect and change the ratio between the rollers and the actual wheels, so could explain this mismatch. This is where the actual rev limiter would more or less kick in at close to 6000 on this graph. So if we consider peak power at 5.7 here, and we know the rev limiter is actually set at 6800 RPM. If we get the torque figure at this point, you would get, at this RPM, you would get 190 horsepower at the wheels, but if it was 6500 RPM, which is more realistic, it would be close to 215 at the wheels, which is would get closer to 245 at the engine, which might seem a bit high, that's for sure. So the only thing we can probably trust is the torque figures, since that's the roller torque. So yeah, if you would consider the engine is rated at peak power at 6000 RPM, and we'd use this figure at 6000 RPM, 174 foot-pound, that would give an approximate 200 horses at the wheels and 2 to 8 ish at the crank, which could be realistic. But anyway, this is not ideal, but yeah, with a power figure somewhere between 220 and 230, I think it's fairly realistic based on the road driving and the cars I've tried to follow on the track. So yeah, I just wanted to get a baseline with this setup. Considering the age and mileage of the engine and the life it had in the past few years, I think these figures are not too bad. Right, I just wanted to check the spark plugs from 1 to 6. They all look pretty similar in terms of coloration, but the oil on the threads, it's pretty sure it's from the cam cover leaking into the spark plug holes. so when you remove them you just get this oil on the threads. But yeah, all the spark plugs look quite similar. And I did a compression test. This is supposed to be a decent gauge, and I did a cold compression test and a hot compression test. On at cold it showed 195-ish psi all over the cylinders, which is probably a bit too high for a high mileage engine. Then I did a hot test twice just to confirm, and it showed around 175-180 psi, except for number 4, which showed 160 psi on a hot test. So that might be a bit hurt, number 4. So anyways, I'm really planning on taking the engine out and opening it up and check everything in there, maybe replace the head, because this one has the old crack in there, which is not ideal. And yeah, I'll see what other things I might do. Of course, it's gonna have to be at on a tight budget, so I'm not gonna go too crazy on this. I just want a fairly healthy, reliable engine.